In a luxurious hall where laughter echoed louder than common sense, a man was publicly challenged to prove his worth, and everyone expected to watch his fall. Between judging glances and raised cell phones, his silence began to bother more than any answer could. It took one call, seemingly simple, to transform mockery into tension and confidence into doubt. Because sometimes true power does not display itself. It waits for the exact moment to act. Before discovering what really happened after that call then, subscribe now for more stories full of twists and surprising moments. The invitation arrived in a sealed envelope, with the golden coat of arms of Valente and Menezes Gestão de Negocios printed in the upper left corner. Raphael Drummond observed it for a few seconds before opening it, passing his thumb over the texture of the coated paper, that kind of expensive material people use when they want you to know they are expensive. Inside, in elegant typography, the invitation to the annual gala night of the Association of Strategic Partners of the Financial Market, to be held in the Grand Ballroom of the Rosewood, São Paulo, on Avenida Presidente Juscelino Kubitschek, in the heart of Itaim Bibi. Date: Friday, November 22nd. Time: from 8 o'clock. Dress code: black tie. Raphael folded the invitation carefully and kept it in the central drawer of his desk, on the 14th floor of the south tower of the complex where the headquarters of Atlantica Capital was located. The investment fund where he held the position of compliance director for just over 3 years. Through the window, the city of São Paulo spread out like a lit electronic circuit, millions of lights blinking in a logic that only made sense to those who knew how to read it. Raphael knew. He was 42 years old, with dark hair and some silver marks at the temples, brown eyes that observed more than they spoke, and a posture that people often confused with coldness. It wasn't coldness. It was concentration. There was a huge difference between the two, but few took the trouble to understand that difference, and Raphael had stopped being bothered by that a long time ago. That Tuesday afternoon, while finishing the review of a risk report that needed to reach the executive committee before the end of the week, his assistant Priscilla knocked lightly on the half-open door of his office. She entered with a printed file and placed it on the desk with the usual seriousness that Raphael appreciated in her. Priscilla was efficient, discreet, and had the rare gift of knowing when not to speak. "The supplementary report on VM Eventos," she said simply, and left. Raphael took the file. VM Eventos was the reason why that invitation was in his drawer. It was also the reason why he had accepted to attend a gala party on a Friday night, when his personal preference would be to be at home, with a good book, and the organized silence of his apartment on Alameda Campinas. But there was no room for personal preferences when work demanded presence. He opened the file and ran his eyes over the numbers, the cash flows, the transfers that followed patterns, slightly deviated from the reasonable, the kind that only appeared when you knew exactly where to look. VM Eventos was a subsidiary of Valente and Menezes, the same Isadora Valente and Cecilia Menezes, who would sign as hostesses at the event on Friday. Women of known presence in the market, frequenters of social columns, owners of a reputation carefully built on foundations that Raphael had spent the last 4 months examining in detail. What he had found was not spectacular. It was worse than spectacular. It was consistent, and documented. He closed the file, leaned back in the chair, and looked at the ceiling for a few seconds. Then he took his cell phone and sent a short message to a contact saved only as MF. Confirmed for Friday. The reply came in less than a minute. Just a positive sign. Raphael put the phone on the desk and went back to the risk report. There was work to do. Friday arrived with the overcast sky typical of November in São Paulo, that humid atmosphere that the city used as a costume in the months preceding summer. Raphael left the apartment at 7:15 in a dark suit with a white shirt and a wine-colored tie, discreet enough not to draw attention, elegant enough to belong to that environment without apparent effort. He went down to the garage, got into the car, and drove to Itaim in silence, without music, just the sound of the engine and the muffled noise of the city outside. The Rosewood was exactly the type of place that event called for. The lobby had high ceilings, noble materials in tones of beige and gold, employees who circulated with the trained fluidity of those who know that discretion is part of the service. The grand ballroom had been prepared with round tables dressed in white linen, arrangements of white and green flowers, tall candles in darkened metal candlesticks, and lighting that made everyone look slightly better than they were. Raphael handed over the invitation at the entrance, received the badge and entered. The hall was already well filled when he arrived, groups forming with the artificial naturalness typical of these environments, where every hug is calculated and every smile has a second line of intention. He recognized some faces, nodded to 2 or 3, gently refused an appetizer offered by a waiter, and positioned himself carefully, like someone who simply circulates but who is actually mapping. It was Isidora Valente who saw him first. She was beside Cecilia Meneses, the two forming a duo of undeniable presence, sophisticated dresses, jewelry that did not shout but whispered fortunes, hair and makeup with the level of finish that only abundant money and available time can sustain. Isidora was around 45 years old, blonde, tall, with a smile that always arrived a bit before the true intention. Cecilia was a brunette, a bit younger, with dark eyes that evaluated the environment with the speed of a security camera. When Isidora recognized Raphael among the guests, something in the corner of her mouth moved. It was subtle, but Raphael saw it. He had spent years learning to read these movements. She approached with Cecilia by her side, and the circle around them expanded naturally, as always happens with people who carry the magnetism of social power. Raphael stood still, with a glass of water in his hand, and waited. "Raphael Drummond," said Isidora, with that cadence that turned any name into a veiled comment. "What a surprise to see you here. I didn't know Atlantica Capital sent representatives to events like this." "Atlantica Capital has an interest in maintaining an active presence in industry associations," he replied, with a voice that neither rose nor fell. "It is a matter of positioning." Cecilia tilted her head slightly, with the kind of smile that precedes a well-rehearsed provocation. "Positioning," she repeated, savoring the word. "Of course. Well said for a compliance man. You always have the right words, don't you? The right words and a lot of caution." There was a deliberate pause before caution, and the pause did the work that the word alone would not. The people around caught the tone. Some turned discreetly. The circus had begun, and Raphael was the center without having asked to be. He took a sip of water, returned the glass to the tray of a waiter passing nearby, and looked at Isidora with an expression that gave nothing away. In his plans, that night was still just beginning. The conversation had the rhythm of something planned to look spontaneous. Isidora Valente knew how to work a crowd. It was one of her most developed skills, probably the most profitable throughout her career, more than any business she had structured or any contract she had signed. She knew where to place a pause, where to place a smile, where to let silence do the dirty work while she kept her hands clean. "I heard that Atlantica Capital is going through a phase of internal restructuring," she said, using that tone of someone sharing confidential information out loud in the middle of a full hall. "Is it true that there were significant changes in the leadership?" Raphael recognized the maneuver immediately. It was the kind of rumor vague enough not to be accurately denied, but specific enough to plant a doubt. There was no restructuring underway at Atlantica. There was, however, a process of reviewing contracts with external partners, a process that directly involved the operations of Valente and Meneses. But that was a detail that Isidora certainly was not sharing by accident. "Every high-performance organization reviews its structures periodically," Raphael replied, with the same neutral temperature as before. "That is governance, not a crisis." Cecilia made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but fulfilled the social function of one. The 2 or 3 people who had approached the circle caught the signal and responded with condescending smiles. Raphael noticed that he knew 2 of them, a manager from a competing fund and a lawyer specializing in corporate law, who worked for clients with a profile similar to the hostess's. It was no coincidence. The audience had been curated. "Governance," repeated Isidora, with the same flavor Cecilia had placed on caution a few minutes earlier. What a beautiful word for such a discrete function. You spend your days looking at spreadsheets, don't you, Raphael? Numbers, tables, Reports that no one reads until someone needs a culprit. There was a collective laugh, low and controlled, the kind of laugh people use when they want to participate in something without fully committing. Raphael did not look away from Isadora. She held the gaze for a moment, and then looked away, which was, in itself, information. "If you want me to explain how compliance works," he said, "I can do that, but perhaps this is not the right place for an introductory lesson." The comment had a knife inside, but a knife wrapped in soft fabric. Those who didn't pay attention heard only the politeness. Those who did heard the cut. Isadora paid attention, and her smile became slightly stiffer. Cecilia decided it was time to press more directly. She turned to the people around with an expression of theatrical amusement. "Do you know what intrigues me about these compliance guys? They walk around with that pose that they know everything, that they have access to privileged information, that they control the backstage." She made a calculated pause. "But when you test it in practice, you discover that it's all much smaller than it seems." "Smaller how?" asked someone from the group feeding the game. "Smaller as in dependent," said Cecilia, turning her eyes back to Raphael with an expression that mixed curiosity and disdain. "Tell me, Raphael, without the backing of Atlantica, without the position, without the title printed on the card, what would you be here? Because it seems to me that you came to this event knowing you don't belong to it, and you're trying to make that look like a strategic choice." It was a cruder provocation than the previous ones. There was a level of aggressiveness there that surpassed the refined social game and entered the territory of direct confrontation. Raphael felt the gaze of other people in the hall turning toward that corner. The scene was becoming too visible to be ignored. He remained silent for a few seconds, which made the tension grow perceptibly. Isadora opened her lips slightly, as if she were going to add something, but Raphael spoke first. "You are right that I came to this event with a specific reason," he said, with a voice that did not rise, but that somehow reached everyone around without needing volume. "And that reason has nothing to do with belonging." "Ah, so you admit it," said Cecilia with a triumphant smile, turning to the group like someone scoring a point. "You came here because someone sent you, to fulfill a function, like an employee." "As a professional," he corrected, without any defensive inflection. Isadora felt that the scene had reached an interesting peak and resolved to force the climax of the moment. It was her specialty, knowing where to squeeze. "Call then," she said, with a wide smile, opening the gesture like someone offering a gift. "Call whoever you want. Call whoever sent you here and ask him to explain why you are in this hall without anything to do." It was a provocation, built to have no adequate answer. If he didn't call, it would look like a bluff. If he called and there was no answer, the humiliation would be complete. If he called and there was an answer, the scene was still hers, because she had given the order. Cecilia reinforced the chorus with a nod and a wide smile, and the people around began to laugh more openly. Raphael looked at Isadora for a moment. Then he looked at his watch. It was 9:43 p.m. He had arranged for 10 p.m., but the circumstances were creating the opportunity to anticipate by 17 minutes. And 17 minutes were a detail that could be absorbed without prejudice to any of the parties involved in what was to come. He took the cell phone out of his jacket pocket with the calm of someone looking for a business card. No rush, no drama. He found the contact, pressed the call key, brought the device to his ear. The hall was still laughing. Isadora crossed her arms with an expression of anticipated satisfaction. Cecilia tilted her head slightly to the side, like someone watching something inevitable. Some of the people around were already exchanging glances, preparing their reaction for when the expected awkward silence arrived, but the call was answered on the second ring. Raphael said only 2 words, with the same voice as always, without any added emotion or drama. "You may start." He hung up, placed the cell phone on the nearest table with a calm movement, crossed his arms slightly, with a relaxed posture, and stood looking at Isadora with an expression that gave absolutely nothing away. The laughter continued for a few seconds, but there was something different in the air now, a current that people could not yet name, but that they were beginning to feel, like the silence before a change in weather, like the pressure that precedes the rain. Isadora kept her smile, but her eyes were working, scanning the environment, searching for something she still couldn't identify, but that her instinct, sharpened by years of maneuvers in environments like that, had registered as a threat. Cecilia felt it too. Her laughter lost some of its muscle, and then, in the opposite corner of the hall, a security guard in a dark suit stopped circulating and stood still against the wall, eyes turned toward the main entrance. Another did the same, on the other side. Like pieces being positioned on a board that only one person in the hall could read in its entirety. Raphael did not turn his head to confirm. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what was happening, because he himself had planned every detail of what was about to happen. The doors of the hall opened with the precision of something rehearsed. It wasn't a sudden movement, it wasn't an invasion. It was something almost choreographed, with a cadence that contrasted with the festive informality of the environment and produced, precisely because of that contrast, an effect of displacement that spread through the hall like a slow wave. 6 people entered, all in dark suits, all with the vertical posture and measured gait of those who carry the authority of a formal function. They carried black briefcases and discreet equipment. 2 of them had badges hanging from their necks, visible but not flaunted. The music playing in the background, a moderate volume jazz that had served as the soundtrack for the night's conversations, was interrupted with a word spoken into the ear of someone responsible for the sound. The silence that followed was not abrupt, but it was definitive. And when the hall went without music, the conversations also lost strength, group by group, table by table, like flames extinguished one by the same gust of wind. Isadora Valente felt her stomach tighten before understanding exactly why. It was the kind of visceral reaction the body produces when it recognizes a pattern of danger before the mind can name it. She turned to Cecilia, who was already staring at the entrance, with the expression of someone trying to process a scene that made no sense within the script she had prepared for that night. One of the men who had entered positioned himself in the center of the hall with the technical naturalness of someone who had done that other times. He didn't need to ask for silence, because the silence had already arrived on its own. He looked at the environment with the serenity of someone who has the situation under control, and with a firm voice and without any dramatic inflection, said what needed to be said. "Good evening, everyone. My name is Henrique Castello. I am a senior auditor from the Operations Supervision Division of the Ethics and Control Commission of the Structured Financial Market. We are here to conduct an emergency audit, duly authorized, on the financial operations linked to tonight's event and the organizing entities. We ask that everyone remain calm and stay where they are for a few minutes." The name of the entity he mentioned was long, technical, and absolutely real. Isadora knew it. Everyone in the hall who had any relationship with the financial market knew it. It was an instance linked to the regulatory supervision system that operated in partnership with the main funds and financial institutions in the country. When that commission appeared unannounced, there was always a specific and documented reason. And the specific and documented reason, that night, had the name of Valente and Menezes. Cecilia opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "What is this?" she said to Isadora, in a low volume that intended to be discreet, but that tension made perfectly audible to the people around. Isadora did not answer. She was calculating. It was one of her most consistent qualities, even under pressure, she calculated. But there was something different this time, a variable she had not inserted into any of the scenarios she had built in recent weeks. When the first signs that someone was looking more closely at VM Eventos' accounts began to appear. She had taken precautions. She had reorganized documents. She had moved some transfers to accounts she considered invisible. But an operation conducted by that commission, with auditors physically present, with documented authorization, at a public event where she and Cecilia were the registered hostesses, was something that surpassed any precaution she had taken. Cecilia's phone vibrated. She looked at the screen. She stood still for 3 seconds that felt much longer. Then she showed the screen to Isadora without saying a word. It was a message from their company's legal department. Short, direct. 5 words that needed no elaboration. "Freeze initiated. Do not comment." Isadora raised her eyes from the phone and looked at Raphael Drummond, who was standing in the same place as before, with his arms crossed slightly and the usual expression. Neutral, present, completely out of reach. Enrique Castello had approached the hostesses with two other auditors by his side. He opened the briefcase he carried and took out a document of several pages, printed on letterhead with a verifiable digital signature. He handed it to Isadora with the protocol of someone fulfilling a procedure that had been practiced many times. Mrs. Isadora Valente, you are receiving at this moment formal notification regarding the start of the audit process for the financial operations of VM Eventos and Valente and Menezes Gestão de Negocios. The document details the scope of the investigation and the rights and obligations of the parties involved. A copy will be delivered to Mrs. Cecilia Menezes simultaneously. Isadora took the document. Her fingers were firm, because she was not going to give the room the satisfaction of seeing her tremble, but the firmness was a conscious effort, not a natural state. She opened the first pages, with her eyes running through the blocks of text with the speed of someone looking for something specific to use as a point of contention. What she found was worse than she expected. The scope was not generic. It was surgical. It listed specific transactions, specific dates, specific values, specific account names. It listed that night's event as part of a chain of operations being investigated. It listed 4 previous events organized by VM Eventos that had served as a structure for irregular financial movements. Someone knew everything. Someone had compiled that with a level of detail that required months of work and access to information that was not public. She looked up and looked at Raphael again. He was still in the same place, but now there was something different in his expression. It wasn't triumph, because triumph requires exhibitionism, and Raphael Drummond had not the slightest inclination for exhibitionism. It was something closer to recognition, like someone seeing a closed equation and noticing with discreet satisfaction that all the elements are in the right place. Someone from the group that had watched the confrontation minutes earlier said, in a voice loud enough to be heard by several around, "Who is this guy anyway?" The answer came from another person who had recognized Raphael through a mutual contact. Compliance Director of Atlantica Capital, and the weight of those words landed in the hall with a gravity that none of the previous laughter could balance anymore. Isadora Valente had spent the night trying to diminish a man. She had carefully built the stage, selected the audience, rehearsed the lines, calculated the moments of pressure. And the man she had chosen as a target had arrived at that hall not to be tested, but to execute something that was underway long before the invitation arrived, in the sealed envelope, with the golden coat of arms of her company. The hall watched, some with curiosity, some with discomfort, some with that neutral expression people use when they know that choosing a side would be premature and prefer to wait and see which way the wind blows. But everyone was looking, and everyone understood that what was happening there was no longer about a conversation between guests at a party. It was something else entirely, and it wasn't over yet. The attempt at contestation came because Isadora Valente was the kind of person who always tries to contest. It was a matter of identity, not just strategy. Yielding without resistance was something she had trained herself never to do, regardless of the circumstances, regardless of the evidence. Resistance was what had brought her to where she was in the market, and she was not going to give it up at the first pressure, even if that pressure came wrapped in letterhead with a digital signature. "This is an invasive procedure without precedent," she said, with a firm voice and a direct gaze at Enrique Castello. "Valente and Menezes has a first-rate legal team, and any process of this nature should be conducted with prior notice of at least 48 business hours, as established by the regulatory protocol." Enrique Castello looked at her with the expression of someone who had heard that argument before, not with disdain, with technical patience. Article 23 of the Commission's regulations expressly provides for an emergency audit without prior notice when there is evidence of immediate risk of alteration or disposal of documents and financial records, he replied, with the same calm cadence as before. The judicial authorization that supports this operation is on pages 6 and 7 of the document you have just received. I suggest reading it before any formal contestation. Isadora looked at pages 6 and 7. The authorization was there, signed, with the correct stamp, with the correct case number, with the date from 2 days ago. Someone had prepared that in advance, and that 2-day advance had been calculated to arrive exactly tonight. Cecilia stood beside her in silence. The lawyer who used to be available for emergency situations was out of the country that week, which had seemed like only a minor inconvenience when she found out, but which now took on a different weight. One of the auditors had connected a notebook to a portable projector that another colleague was holding. In a matter of minutes, without ceremony, without a dramatic presentation, just with the efficiency of someone fulfilling a technical procedure, a series of tables and flowcharts appeared projected on one of the side walls of the hall. The guests, who until then had been circulating with caution, trying to understand what was happening without committing themselves, were naturally drawn to the projection. What was there was a financial structure, simple in its presentation, but devastating in its implication. It showed the flow of resources passing through the events organized by VM Eventos, values received from sponsors, values declared in public contracts, and values effectively moved in the operational accounts. There was a consistent difference between the first two and the third, a difference that repeated across 4 consecutive events with percentage variations that suggested not an error but a method. The kind of difference that doesn't appear in a superficial audit, the kind that only appears when someone knows where to look, has access to the correct data, and dedicated enough time to reconstruct the complete chain. Someone in the back of the hall said quietly, "My God." It wasn't to anyone. It was just the sound that escapes when the weight of a sudden understanding doesn't fit in silence. Isadora looked at the projection and felt for the first time that night that the ground under her feet was becoming unstable. It wasn't the presence of the auditors that produced that sensation. It was the detail of what was being shown. It was the level of specificity. It was the fact that there was the name of an account she had opened in partnership with an intermediary she believed to be completely discreet. An account that did not appear in any document she had voluntarily handed over in any previous review. "Where did this come from?" she said, and the volume of her voice had decreased in a way she had not planned. Henrique Castello did not answer directly. It was a question that needed no answer because the answer was implicit in everyone's presence there. Raphael Drummond had moved. Not dramatically, not like someone making an entrance. He just repositioned himself slightly, so that he was at an angle that allowed him to see both the projection and the 2 women. It was a positioning detail that would go unnoticed by most, but that for those who knew him revealed he had chosen that specific point in advance. Cecilia Menezes looked at him. She looked for a long time, with an expression that had lost all its calculated social lightness and was showing something more real underneath, a combination of anger and recognition. The anger was understandable. The recognition was what really hurt, because it meant she was understanding, in real time, the magnitude of what had happened. "You knew," she said to Raphael, not as a question. "I knew," he confirmed, without any inflection of satisfaction in his voice. "Since when?" Raphael did not answer immediately. He looked at her for a moment before speaking. "Since before the invitation arrived." Those words had a specific weight. They meant he had received the invitation knowing what the invitation was. They meant that everything that had happened in that hall, including the scene of public humiliation the 2 had built so carefully, had happened within a frame he already knew. He had not been caught by surprise. He had entered that frame with his eyes open. Isadora turned to him. Her composure had cracked, but it hadn't broken completely. It was her most consistent quality, the ability to maintain a facade even when the interior was collapsing. "So you came here to expose us," she said, "like a spectacle, like a theater." "I didn't come to create a spectacle," he replied. "The spectacle was your creation. I just came to fulfill a function." The word function resonated in the hall with a resonance that no one there failed to catch. It was the same word Cecilia had used as a weapon minutes before when she had said he had come to fulfill a function as an employee. The difference was that now the function had been revealed in its full extent, and there was nothing diminutive about it anymore. Henrique Castello resumed the procedure with the same efficiency as before. The contracts linked to the events were being formally suspended. Access to certain accounts was being blocked as a precautionary measure, as per judicial authorization. A complete investigation would be conducted in the following days, with all due formalities. The two partners could remain at the event, but could not leave without formally notifying the commission. Cecilia closed her eyes for a second. When she opened them, the hall was still there, full of faces she knew, of people she had negotiated with, had lunch with, had exchanged messages and references and favors with over years, and everyone was looking at her. There was no more music. There was no more soft noise of overlapping conversations. There was only the discreet sound of the auditors working and the collective weight of an audience that had come for a party and stayed for something else entirely. Isadora Valente looked at Rafael one last time at that moment, and for the first time since she had spotted him in the hall, there was no smile on her face. There was only the dry expression of someone counting the steps of a defeat she hadn't yet fully accepted, but that she knew in the deepest part of herself was real. The hall emptied gradually, not by order, but by the natural force of collective embarrassment. People who had no direct link to Valente and Menezes began to withdraw in small groups, with the discreet care of someone leaving a wake before the end so as not to have to answer questions. Some stopped at the exit for a last look, half curiosity, half relief at not being in the center of it. The waiters, not knowing for sure if they should continue serving or collect the trays, opted for the latter with the professional instinct of those who realize when a party has turned into something else. Raphael Drummond stayed until after most had left. Not for show, not to prolong the moment. He stayed because there were procedures to follow and because his presence was functionally necessary at that stage of the process. While Henrique Castello and his team concluded the work of formal notification and initial documentation, Raphael sat in one of the chairs that had been vacated near the wall, with a glass of water he had taken from an abandoned tray, and remained in silence. It was in these moments of silence that things settled. He had learned this over time, that great actions produce a lot of noise before and during, and that only in the silence after can you see what really happened and what it meant in the bigger picture. What had happened that night was not the end of anything. It was a stage, an important stage, a necessary stage, but still just a stage in a chain that had begun long before and that would extend for weeks or months still. 4 months earlier, Raphael had received on a Monday morning an encrypted email from an address he didn't recognize. The email contained only a compressed file and a line of text. "You'll want to see this before it disappears." He had opened the file with the proper security protocols and found a series of screenshots of financial transactions accompanied by records of internal communications. The material was fragmented, incomplete, but enough to indicate a direction. He hadn't taken it straight to the top as some would. He had started verifying on his own carefully, building a chain of evidence that could support a formal process. It was the kind of work that required patience because haste produces flaws and flaws produce legal loopholes that invalidate processes. He knew that better than anyone. What he had found over the following weeks was a structure that used corporate events as a mechanism for moving resources that could not circulate through conventional channels. It wasn't improvisation. It was a system with internal logic, with redundancies, with hedging mechanisms. Someone had thought a lot before setting that up. What made that structure especially delicate was that it had contact points with at least 3 investment funds that operated in the same ecosystem as Atlantica Capital. This meant that any poorly conducted investigation could generate side effects that would contaminate parts of the market that had no relation to the original problem. It was necessary to be surgical. Raphael had taken the material to MF, who was Marcelo Fonseca, the person responsible for supervising the control commission that had appeared that night at the Rosewood. Marcelo was a career professional Raphael had known for 12 years, since they both worked in different institutions and crossed paths in regulatory forums. There was a trust between them, built on years of consistent work, without favors and without debts, just the mutual respect of someone who recognizes competence in the other person. When Raphael presented the material to Marcelo, the two spent 3 hours analyzing every element before talking about what it implied. In the end, Marcelo had said, "If we do this the long way, They'll notice and they'll erase it. We need a window. And Raphael had replied, I can get the window. The window was the gala event. Isadora and Cecilia had organized that event for 4 consecutive years, always on the same date, always in the same format, always with the same partners. It was a ritual of social and business consolidation that they would not give up, especially now when they needed to show the market that Valente and Menezes was solid and relevant. They were never going to cancel, regardless of what was happening behind the scenes. The invitation had arrived for Raphael because the name of Atlantica Capital was on the list of strategic partners for the event, and the presence of a representative was expected. When he confirmed attendance, he knew that the next few hours would be controlled by a logic he had helped build. What he hadn't planned in detail was the extent of the scene Isadora and Cecilia were going to create around him, although he wasn't surprised. He knew their profile well enough to know they wouldn't resist the opportunity to use his presence as social theatre material, and there was a reason why he hadn't tried to avoid that scene. Their public scene with witnesses with recordable context produced a type of informal documentation that complemented the formal process. It wasn't legal proof. It was something more subtle. It was the narrative. The narrative of those who had treated a serious regulatory process as a stage for power games. And narratives in the financial market have their own weight. He hadn't responded with indignation to the provocations of the two. He hadn't defended himself. He had let the scene develop to the exact point where making the call was the most natural gesture in the world, and he had made the call without drama, without a speech, without any element that could be read as arrogance or theatricality on his part. Because Raphael knew that the difference between justice and revenge is visible in the way you behave when you have the power, and he had chosen, with a lot of deliberation, to behave in the least dramatic way possible, because that was the way that respected the process and made the result more solid. Enrique Castello approached with a closed folder in his hand. We have concluded the notification stage, he said. The team will continue tomorrow morning with Phase 2. The partners have been advised about the temporary restrictions. Any resistance? Raphael asked. Mrs. Valente asked 4 times for her lawyer. The legal advisor we managed to contact confirmed he returns on Monday. Until then, they only have guidance not to make any decisions regarding the frozen assets. Raphael nodded slightly. Thank you, Enrique. Castello left. Raphael stayed another moment sitting in the almost empty hall, with the tables still dressed in white linen and the flower arrangements no one had removed, the scene of the party suspended in the air like a photograph of something that had been and was now just context. He thought about the anonymous email from 4 months ago, about the sender who had never identified himself, about that phrase, "You'll want to see this before it disappears." There was something in that phrase that still bothered him slightly, a detail of phrasing that he hadn't been able to dismiss completely. Someone had wanted him to see that. Someone had specifically chosen the compliance director of Atlantica Capital as the recipient of that information, and that someone knew with enough precision to use that encrypted email that Raphael would verify, would build the case, and would conduct it the right way. There was a question that detail opened, and that Raphael still hadn't been able to answer completely. Why him? Monday arrived with that cold, early morning light that São Paulo uses at the end of November, when the sun hasn't yet decided if it will truly appear or just hint. Raphael arrived at the office before 8, as he always did on days that required concentration before the floor began to fill with presence and movement. His desk was organized with that type of order that is not aesthetic but functional. Everything in the place that makes sense for the person using that space, and that would be incomprehensible to anyone else. He opened the notebook and stood looking for a few seconds at the file folder he had named simply VM before opening any document. It was a habit he had developed over the years, before resuming a process, stopping for a moment and trying to see the whole before going back to the detail. The whole was always different after a night's sleep than it was before. Some things that seemed like solid connections sometimes revealed weaknesses. Some things that seemed like minor details sometimes revealed they were the center. The question that had stayed with him in the empty Rosewood Hall was still there. Why him? There were obvious answers. Atlantica Capital was one of the institutions with the greatest exposure to the portfolio of events VM Eventos managed. Raphael was the compliance director, the professional whose specific function was to find exactly the kind of irregularity that had been detected. There was logic in choosing him as the recipient of information that needed to get to the right place, but there was a problem with the obvious answers. The encrypted file that had arrived in the email didn't just contain financial data. It also contained a record of internal communication from Valente and Meneses that specifically referenced the name of Atlantica Capital and his name. It was an exchange of messages between Isadora and Cecilia, dated 6 months earlier, discussing the possibility of using Atlantica's presence in a structure they were setting up. And there was, in one of the messages, a reference to Raphael that said, "Drummond won't notice. His profile is process, not operation. He lives buried in spreadsheets." That reference had arrived along with the financial data, and that had a specific implication. Whoever had sent the file knew not only about the financial irregularities, but also about the internal conversation at Valente and Meneses that mentioned Raphael. This meant the source had access to the inside of that company. It wasn't someone from the outside looking in, it was someone from the inside. Raphael had kept that information separate, in its own compartment, while conducting the main process. It was the kind of detail that might or might not be relevant, and that would only reveal its relevance over time. He had learned not to force connections before they were ready to be seen. On the Tuesday after the event, Enrique Castello called in the morning. Phase 2 of the audit had progressed beyond expectations. The team had found, within VM Eventos' servers, records that confirmed the method described in the anonymous file data, but with an additional detail that hadn't been foreseen. There was a third name in the internal records, someone who had acted as an intermediary between the partners and the system of accounts that processed the irregular movements. "Who is it?" Raphael asked. Castello made a pause that was itself information. "It's a name you know, Rodrigo Salave, from Salave Consultoria de Investimentos." Raphael was silent for a few seconds. Rodrigo Salave was an independent consultant who had worked with Atlantica Capital 2 years ago on a portfolio restructuring project that had lasted about 8 months. It hadn't ended well. Salave had presented proposals that the Ethics Committee had refused due to a lack of transparency in the financial models, and Raphael had been the most direct voice in that refusal. Salave had left the partnership without open conflict, but the kind of exit that leaves residue. "Does this change the scope?" Raphael asked. "It expands it," said Castello. "It means the irregularities were not just internal to Valente and Meneses. There was an external support structure, and that support had roots that reach closer to Atlantica than we would like." Raphael hung up the call and stood looking out the window for a moment. The city outside moved with its own logic, indifferent. He went back to the VM folder on the notebook and opened the original email file. He read again the line of text that had accompanied the file. "You'll want to see this before it disappears." Now with Salave in the frame, the phrase had another layer of meaning, because Salave had been in the structure long enough to know it was becoming fragile. And if Salave had decided it was better to get out before the weight collapsed, one of the most efficient ways to protect himself was to ensure someone else got to the evidence before it vanished. A specific person, with the right profile, who was capable of conducting the process so that Salave remained at the minimum on the periphery, not the center. Raphael hadn't been chosen just for competence. He had been chosen because it was convenient for someone who needed an out. He opened a new document and began to write with the speed of someone organizing a thought that needs to be captured before any detail slips away. Did Salave's name appear in the anonymous file? No. The file showed VM Eventos' irregularities without mentioning the intermediary, which meant the file had been built to reveal the minimum necessary to provoke an investigation without including the element that would lead directly to the sender. There was a perverse elegance in that, and a considerable irony in the fact that whoever had tried to use the investigation as protection was now in the path of the very investigation they had initiated. On Wednesday afternoon, Raphael received a call from a number he didn't recognize. He answered. "Drummond?" said the voice on the other side, with that kind of calculated informality people use when they want to seem comfortable but are tense. "Yes," Raphael replied. "This is Rodrigo Salave. I think we need to talk." Raphael looked at his watch. São Paulo continued moving outside. The city didn't pause for contexts. He replied with the same voice as always, the one that neither rose nor fell. Where and when? And while arranging the details, a part of his attention was entirely focused on a single question: how to conduct that meeting in a way to obtain the maximum information without compromising any element of the process that was still ongoing. Because the game had expanded its board, and Raphael needed to play at all levels at the same time, with the same precision that had led that Friday night to a result that many in that hall were still processing. And the most complex part was yet to come. They met on a Thursday morning at a café on Rua Leopoldo Couto de Magalhães in Itaim. The kind of place that is always full, but always has tables with enough privacy if you arrive early and know where to sit. Raphael arrived 10 minutes early. He ordered a coffee, chose a table in the back with his back to the wall and a view of the entrance, and waited. Rodrigo Salave arrived on time, which Raphael registered as the first sign that this man wanted to look controlled. He was 48 years old with well-cut grey hair, a dark suit of European cut, no tie. The kind of look that said, independent but organized. He scanned the café with his eyes before identifying Raphael, and when the two met, Raphael saw in Salave's eyes something he recognized immediately. It wasn't guilt, it was calculation. Salave hadn't come to confess. He had come to negotiate. He sat down, ordered an espresso from the waiter who approached, and placed his hands on the table so that both were visible. It was a gesture of deliberate openness, and Raphael registered it without comment. "Thanks for coming," said Salave. "You asked to talk," Raphael replied. "I'm listening." Salave took a moment. The espresso arrived and he wrapped his fingers around the cup without drinking. "I know my name appeared in the process." "Where did you get that information?" The question was direct and had no intonation of accusation. It was just a question. "Cecilia called me after the event. She was scared. She said the audit had found records that cited me." He paused. "She shouldn't have called. She was probably impulsive." "Probably," said Raphael. "I want you to understand my role in that," said Salave, with a voice that had found its level neither too high nor too low. "I wasn't part of the structure. I was consulted on some operations and made decisions that, with the benefit of hindsight, were not the most prudent. But I didn't have visibility over everything Isadora and Cecilia were doing." Raphael looked at him, said nothing. Salave continued. "When I realized the extent of what was being set up, I made the decision to step away. That was why I ended the relationship with Valente and Menezes at the beginning of the year. Not because of a scheduling conflict, as was formally stated, because of a risk assessment." "Risk assessment," repeated Raphael, with the same neutral temperature he had used in the Rosewood Hall. "Yes." Salave raised his eyes from the cup and looked directly at him. "And that was why I sent the file." The Rosewood Hall had had its dramatic silence. This one was different. It was the type of silence that happens when a piece that was loose finally finds the fit, and the sound it produces is not a bang, but a very precise click. "You sent the encrypted email," said Raphael, not as a question. "Yes." "In February?" "Yes." Raphael took the coffee, took a sip, put it back on the table carefully. "Why me?" And then Salave said something Raphael hadn't anticipated in any of the scenarios he had built. "Because 2 years ago, when you refused my proposals for Atlantica, you were the only one who told me personally what the problem was and why. Everyone else on the committee used vague corporate language. You were direct. You said the models had opacity and that opacity was not compatible with the standards Atlantica needed to maintain. You said that to my face, without euphemism." Raphael was silent. "At the time I was annoyed," continued Salave, with an honesty that seemed to cost some effort but appeared genuine. "I spent weeks thinking you had been arrogant, but over time I realized you had done the only thing someone in that position of power should do. You told the truth without sugarcoating. And when I needed to decide who to send that file to, I thought, who will treat this as a process and not as an instrument? And the name that came to me was yours." Raphael sat looking at Salave for a moment. It was a well-constructed narrative. It had emotional coherence, It had an arc. It had an internal logic that made it hard to find the seam. The problem was that well-constructed narratives were exactly the territory where one should be most careful. "You knew your name would appear in the process," said Raphael. "I knew there was risk," admitted Salave. "And you calculated that coming here with this story would make the process easier for you." Salave didn't deny it. It was a sign of intelligence, or at least enough knowledge of the terrain to know that denying it would be worse. "I calculated that being transparent would be better than waiting," he said. "Transparent would have been identifying yourself in the February email," said Raphael. Silence. "Transparent would have been looking for the commission directly, not waiting for your name to appear in the process to present yourself." More silence. Salave looked at the cup. Raphael continued, "But you made a different choice. You provided information that was real, in a way that allowed the investigation to advance without including your participation in the initial frame. And now that your name appeared anyway, you are here to offer me a version of facts that positions you as a source, not as a participant." Salave looked up. There was something in them that was no longer calculation. It was something closer to exhaustion. "I participated in things I shouldn't have participated in," he said, with a voice that had lost its polished layer. "I'm not trying to erase that. I'm trying to ensure that what I did right is also recorded." It was the first sentence that sounded completely true since Salave had sat at the table. Raphael was silent for a few seconds. Then he said, "What you did to facilitate the investigation will be recorded. What you did before will also be recorded. It's not with me that you need to have this conversation. It's with Henrique Castello." Salave nodded slightly, like someone who knew that was the answer he would receive but needed to try anyway. He took the espresso cup, which had cooled completely during the conversation, and drank it all at once like someone closing a ritual. "Are you going to recommend cooperation for me?" he asked. "I'm going to recommend that you be honest with the commission about everything," said Raphael. "What they do with that is their decision, not mine." Salave stood up, extended his hand. Raphael shook it. The grip was firm on both sides, with the seriousness of two men who had had a conversation that neither had found comfortable but both recognized as necessary. Salave left. Raphael remained seated, with half-finished coffee, looking out the window at Rua Leopoldo Couto de Magalhães, where the city followed its own rhythm without pauses, without dramatic considerations. There was a dimension of that conversation that he needed to process carefully. What Salave had said about the reason for choosing him, about the meeting 2 years ago, about telling the truth without euphemism. Raphael had done that without thinking much, because it was simply the correct way to conduct that kind of situation, and he hadn't attributed any particular weight to it. And that had, 2 years later, determined the course of an entire investigation. There was something in this chain of cause and effect that required being seen in a broader perspective, because if there was a lesson there, it wasn't about strategy or process. It was about what happens when you act with consistency, even when it seems inconsequential. The phone vibrated. It was a message from Marcelo Fonseca. "Salave contacted the commission. Meeting scheduled for tomorrow. Looks like he will cooperate fully." Raphael put the phone in his pocket, left a bill on the table for the coffee, stood up and went out to the street where São Paulo continued happening at all volumes at once, indifferent and immense and absolutely real. 2 weeks after the event at the Rosewood, Raphael was summoned to a meeting that wasn't on the regular agenda. The invitation arrived via message from Marcelo Fonseca on a Friday afternoon, with only one additional detail besides the time and place. "There are people here you need to meet." The location was the 12th floor of a building on Avenida Faria Lima that Raphael didn't frequent regularly. The address belonged to the Independent Sectoral Supervision Council, an organism that operated above Castello's commission in the hierarchy of financial market control. It was the kind of instance that appeared rarely on the public surface of things, but whose influence on what happened behind the scenes was considerable. He arrived on time. Priscilla had cancelled the afternoon appointments without needing an explanation, because there was something in the way Raphael had requested the cancellation that dispensed with elaboration. She knew how to recognize when something was different from other days. The meeting room had large windows, with a view of Faria Lima below, a financial city within a larger city, with its specific logic of towers and flows and decisions that moved numbers most people would never see. Marcelo Fonseca was there, along with two people Rafael didn't know personally, but whose names he recognized. Dr. Vivian Serrano, Operations Superintendent of the Sectoral Council, and Dr. Paulo Henrique Ramos, former president of the regulatory instance that had granted Castello's commission the intervention powers used at the Rosewood. There were formal and brief greetings. No one wasted time with unnecessary social protocols, which Rafael interpreted as mutual respect. They sat down. Dr. Serrano was direct. "Mr. Drummond, what we would like to do in this meeting is contextualize you on dimensions of the process in which you participated without having full visibility." Rafael looked at her with an expression that was attention without expectation. "I'm listening." "The Valente and Menezes investigation didn't start when you received the anonymous email in February," she said. "It started 18 months before that." There was a moment of silence. Rafael processed the information without reacting externally. 18 months. That meant the investigation had started long before any element he had known. There was an entirely different chronology from the one he had built, and it stretched back well beyond the encrypted file, well beyond Salav, well beyond his own participation in the process. "Why 18 months?" he asked. "Because VM Eventos' structure was linked to a larger scheme that took that long to be completely mapped," said Dr. Ramos. "There were connections with 3 other companies in the corporate events sector in São Paulo, Rio, and Brasilia, all using similar operational models with different degrees of sophistication. And Valente and Menezes was the most visible link," said Rafael. "It was the link that could be moved in a way to produce an effect that reached the others," said Dr. Serrano. "VM Eventos' irregularities were real and sufficient to support the process Dr. Castello's commission conducted, but the gala event was chosen not just because it was a convenient window." She opened a folder and slid a 2-page document across the table. Rafael took it. It was an operational strategy report, dated 9 months earlier. It had the Sectoral Council stamp, and in the methodology section there was a paragraph he read twice before continuing. The paragraph described the need for a public exposure event that would function as a revelation catalyst, producing controlled visibility over the irregular structure so that the market impact was one of transparency, not scandal. For this, it was necessary for a compliance professional of high credibility and sectoral visibility to be the vector of the intervention, so that the process was perceived as systemic and not as persecution. And there was, right below, a list of profiles considered for this role. Rafael Drummond's name was the second on the list. What had replaced the first candidate was a footnote saying that the original candidate had been removed due to a conflict of interest identified in an internal audit. Rafael's name had been marked as the final recommendation 6 months before the event. He placed the document on the table carefully. "I was chosen by you," he said, not with accusation, but with the precision of someone stating a fact. "You were identified as the professional with the most suitable profile to conduct this stage of the process, so that the results were sustainable," said Dr. Serrano. "Your reputation for independence, your trajectory without incidents, and especially your history of integrity in the decisions you made throughout your career made your name the most consistent with what the process needed." "And the anonymous email in February," said Rafael. "It was sent with our knowledge," admitted Marcelo Fonseca, for the first time in that meeting. "Not by us directly. Salava made the decision to send it on his own, but we knew he had the material and that there was a considerable probability he would use it that way. We let the process occur naturally because his spontaneous participation made the chain more solid from a procedural point of view." Rafael was silent for a moment. It was the revelation that had been coming since that question in an empty hall. Why me? The answer was bigger than he had imagined, and at the same time there was a clarity in it that was almost simple. He had been chosen not by manipulation but by consistency, by years of work that had produced a reputation that made him the most reliable instrument available for that specific end. There was something he needed to say, and he said it with the same voice as always. I would have done exactly the same if I had known everything from the beginning. Dr. Serrano looked at him. We know. That was exactly why we chose not to tell. It was an answer that contained a cold logic and at the same time a confidence that Raphael recognized as the most demanding type of recognition, the recognition that doesn't need to be announced because it is embedded in the action. There is a second phase of the process, said Dr. Ramos, the other 3 companies. We are going to need someone with visibility to coordinate the market communication part in the coming months, ensuring that the perception of regulatory credibility is maintained during the process. Raphael looked at him. You are offering me a role in Phase 2. I am asking if you are willing to have that role, said Dr. Ramos. Raphael looked out the window at Faria Lima below, at the towers, at the movement of cars and people who from above looked like ants following invisible trails, at the city that never stopped, that processed fortunes and failures with the same efficient indifference. He thought about 4 months of solitary work, of careful verifications, of nights of spreadsheets and documents, of a Friday in a hall with jazz music in the background and the calculated provocation of 2 women who thought they were in control of the scene. He thought about 2 words spoken on the phone in a room full of people who laughed. He thought about the cold espresso cup on a cafe table in Itaim, and a man who had said he remembered a meeting 2 years ago when someone had told the truth without euphemism. Yes, he said, I'm willing. And when that word came out, he felt what he rarely felt. Not satisfaction, which was too small, but something closer to alignment. The feeling that what had been done and what would be done were in the same direction, and that this direction was the correct one. The meeting continued for another hour, with details and schedules and implications that Raphael began to map with the attention he reserved for things that mattered. Outside, Faria Lima continued happening in all its simultaneous volumes, and somewhere in the city, Isadora Valente and Cecilia Meneses began to understand that the Rosewood event had not been an end. It was just an inflection point in a much larger process, conducted by people who worked in silence, with patience and precision, and who understood that the greatest results don't arrive with noise, but with the accumulation of correct actions done at the right moment. 3 months later, São Paulo had a temperature that couldn't decide between the dry heat of summer and the rains that arrived without warning, leaving the city humid and charged with an electric energy that people born there call normal and any other place would call intense. It was the kind of day when the city seems larger than it is, as if the humidity dilated distances and made every journey a bit longer than the map indicates. Raphael had arrived at the office at 8:15, which was 15 minutes later than his usual pattern, which Priscilla had noticed without commenting, because they were the 3 extra minutes that sometimes indicated a good night's sleep, and the remaining 12 indicated he had had coffee at home instead of on the way, which in turn indicated a quieter morning. She had learned to read these patterns over the years without ever verbalizing that she read them, because verbalizing made it strange and not verbalizing made it functional. The Valente and Meneses case had followed its course with the solidity that the months of preparation had guaranteed. The irregularities were formally documented, and the legal responsibilities of the partners were established within the appropriate right. Neither of the two had remained silent, which was expected, and the lawyers had done the work lawyers do in situations like that, with arguments that sought to nuance and reduce without entirely denying. The process was in the hands of the correct organisms, and Raphael had done what had been asked of him at the Faria Lima meeting, communicate to the market, with precision and without alarmism, that the supervision system had worked, and that the control mechanisms were operational. That had produced an effect he hadn't fully foreseen. Calls from other professionals in the sector who wanted to understand how the process had been conducted, an invitation to a panel on compliance in the financial market at a conference that would take place in March, an article in a specialized outlet describing the operation as an example of efficient, integrated supervision. He had read the article without any particular expression because the way journalists framed things was always slightly different from reality. But the core was correct, and the core was what mattered. Rodrigo Salave had cooperated with the Commission extensively, as Marcelo had anticipated. The information he provided had helped complete parts of the map that were missing about the other companies. His situation was still being evaluated by the competent instance, with the weight of cooperation being considered in the general frame. Raphael had not interfered in that evaluation, nor had he been requested to do so. He had only confirmed, when asked, that Salave had been the initial source of the investigation. The second phase of the process had begun discreetly, without gala events, without public confrontations. It was a work of methodical supervision that advanced beneath the surface, without making noise, the kind that only becomes visible when it is complete. Raphael had a specific role in this phase, a role that required the same type of patience that had marked the previous 4 months, but with the advantage that now he knew the full picture. There was an afternoon at the end of December when he had left the office earlier than usual and driven to Ibirapuera Park without any specific reason. He had parked, entered through the gate near the MAC, and walked for a while without a determined destination. The park at that time was a horizontal summary of the city. Runners and families and couples and lone people with headphones, each carrying some version of their own week inside their head, while their feet followed the asphalt and the packed earth ground. He had sat on a bench near the lake, with the sound of children playing in the background and ducks moving in the water with that comical dignity ducks have, and had remained seated for almost an hour without a phone, without any document in his head, just present in that space. It was rare for him. But there was something that needed to be processed at that level, not as analysis but as experience. What had happened in the previous months was not just a well-conducted process. It was also a set of encounters with people who revealed, each in their own way, the complexity of motives that lead someone to act. Salave, with his mixture of regret and calculation. Isadora, with her arrogance that was also, underneath, a form of fear. Cecilia, with her misdirected loyalty to a partnership that didn't deserve loyalty. Marcelo, with his strategic confidence that had opted not to explain because the explanation would compromise the result. Dr. Serrano, with her coldness that was efficiency, not indifference. And himself, with what he had discovered about himself, that consistency was not just a work method, it was also the way he existed in the world, and that this had consequences that went far beyond what he saw or controlled. That telling the truth to a man in a meeting, 2 years before, without euphemism and without drama, had set a gear in motion that culminated on a Friday in November in a hall with golden lights and jazz in the background. On that bench in Ibirapuera, he had understood something that didn't fit in a compliance report, and that probably wouldn't go into any supervision document. That the things we do with integrity when it seems inconsequential are exactly the ones that have the most consequence. Not immediately, not visibly, but in a way that works beneath the surface of time and emerges, eventually, at the exact moment it needs to emerge. One of the ducks had approached the bench with that perpetual expression of slight indignation ducks have, and Raphael had stood looking at it for a few seconds, with something that, if someone had seen his face at that moment, could have been described as the beginning of a smile. Then he stood up, put his hands in his jacket pockets and went back to the car. The city waited. Work waited. And both had, for him, the same natural weight of things that exist and that need to be treated with the attention they deserve, no more, no less. The following week, Priscilla had placed the invitation for the March panel on the table. Raphael had read it, placed it in the central drawer with the usual care, and returned to the report he was reviewing. There was in that gesture something that defined everything. The same desk, the same drawer, the same work. The world around had moved in significant ways, people had faced consequences, structures had been undone, power narratives had collapsed on a gala night with jazz in the background, and he was there in the same chair with his eyes on the next document because that was exactly what he had chosen to be, not the protagonist of a show, but the fixed point around which the right things could happen. It was enough, it was in a way everything. Sometimes silence is not submission. Sometimes it is just the sound that true work makes while it happens. End of story. If you made it this far, you know what it's like to be stuck in a story from beginning to end. Raphael Drummond didn't scream or need to defend himself, and yet he transformed an entire night. This is what the best stories do to us. They show that true power doesn't make noise, it simply happens. If this narrative touched you, if you stayed on every detail waiting for the next moment, then you already understand what our channel does every week. Subscribe now, turn on the bell so you don't miss any episodes, and leave in the comments what the moment was that most surprised you in this story. Every week, we bring new narratives, new characters, new silences that speak louder than any speech. The next story is waiting for you.